The winter of 1872 was the harshest anyone could remember in Northern California. Snow piled higher than cabin roofs, and the bitter wind cut through even the thickest blankets. Sarah Mitchell stood at her small cabin window, watching her breath fog the glass as she looked out at the endless white landscape. Her baby daughter Emma lay sleeping in a wooden crate that served as a crib, wrapped in every piece of cloth Sarah could find. Sarah's husband had left 3 months ago, promising to return with supplies and money from his work at the lumber camp. The promises felt empty now, like the food barrels that had been empty for weeks. Her stomach cramped with hunger, and she pressed a hand to her side, trying to ignore the pain that had become her constant companion. The cabin was little more than 4 walls and a roof, built hastily when they first arrived in this remote valley. Cracks between the wooden boards let in cold air that no amount of stuffing with rags could stop. The small fireplace barely warmed the single room, and Sarah had been burning furniture for the past week when the firewood ran out. Outside, she could see smoke rising from the Modoc camp in the distance. The Native American tribe had been living in this valley long before settlers like Sarah and her husband arrived. They seemed to move through the harsh winter with an ease that amazed and frustrated her. While she struggled to find food, they appeared to have enough to survive comfortably. Sarah had heard stories about the Modoc people from other settlers. Some said they were dangerous and should be avoided. Others claimed they were peaceful and would help anyone in need. Sarah had never spoken to any of them directly, but she had seen them from afar when they passed by her cabin. They moved silently through the snow, their faces showing no expression as they went about their daily tasks. The baby started crying, and Sarah rushed to pick her up. Emma felt lighter than she should, and Sarah's heart broke knowing her milk was barely enough to keep the child alive. She had been eating bark soup and the last few dried berries she had saved, but it wasn't enough to nourish both of them. That morning, Sarah had found tracks in the snow around her cabin. They were different from the usual animal tracks she had learned to recognize. These were human footprints, and they seemed to circle her home before disappearing back toward the Modoc camp. Someone had been watching her, studying her situation. As she held Emma close, Sarah made a desperate decision. She wrapped herself in the baby in every blanket she owned and stepped outside into the freezing air. The snow crunched under her feet as she began walking toward the smoke in the distance. Each step was difficult in the deep snow, and she had to stop several times to catch her breath. The Modoc camp appeared larger as she got closer. Several teepees were arranged in a circle, with paths cleared between them. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and Sarah could smell something that made her mouth water. It had been so long since she had eaten real food that even the distant smell made her feel dizzy with hunger. A few Modoc people noticed her approach, but they didn't react with surprise or alarm. They simply watched as she struggled through the snow with her baby. An elderly woman emerged from one of the larger teepees and walked toward Sarah. Her face was weathered but kind, and her dark eyes seemed to understand Sarah's desperation without any words being spoken. The woman gestured for Sarah to follow her to the central fire where several people were gathered. Sarah noticed they had plenty of food cooking over the flames. Dried meat roots and what looked like beans filled several pots. The warmth from the fire felt wonderful after the cold walk, and Sarah found herself crying tears that froze on her cheeks. Through broken English and hand gestures, Sarah tried to explain her situation. She pointed to her empty stomach, to the baby, and back toward her cabin. The Modoc people listened patiently, their faces showing neither judgment nor pity. They seemed to be discussing her situation among themselves in their own language. Finally, the elderly woman spoke in careful English. She told Sarah that they understood her need and that they could help her. But she also made it clear that help always came with a price. In their culture, everything had value, and nothing was given freely without something being offered in return. Sarah nodded eagerly, not fully understanding what the woman meant, but desperate for any help they could provide. The baby was crying again, and Sarah could feel her own strength leaving her body. She knew that without help, both she and Emma would not survive another week in the cabin. The elderly woman introduced herself as White Dove, and she invited Sarah to sit by the warm fire while the other Modoc people continued their daily activities around the camp. Children played in the snow nearby, their laughter creating a stark contrast to the silence that had filled Sarah's world for weeks. These people had found ways to thrive in conditions that were slowly killing her. White Dove brought Sarah a bowl of warm broth made from roots and dried meat. The taste was strange but wonderful, and Sarah felt strength returning to her body with each sip. The baby stopped crying and seemed calmer in the warmth of the camp.
Several Modoc women looked at Emma with gentle expressions, and one brought a soft fur blanket to wrap around the child. As Sarah ate, White Dove explained more about their way of life.
The Modoc people had lived through many harsh winters in this valley. They knew which plants could be stored for food, how to hunt in deep snow, and how to make warm shelters that kept out the cold. Their knowledge had been passed down through generations, and it allowed them to survive when newcomers like Sarah struggled. But White Dove also explained that their resources were not unlimited. The winter had been hard on everyone, and they had to be careful about sharing their supplies. The white settlers had changed many things in the valley, making it harder for the Modoc people to live as they always had. Some of their traditional hunting grounds were now claimed by farmers and ranchers who didn't want Native Americans on their land. Sarah listened carefully as White Dove spoke about the balance of giving and taking. In Modoc culture, when someone received help, they were expected to give something of equal value in return. This might be work, goods, or services, but it was always something meaningful. The elderly woman's eyes studied Sarah carefully as she explained this concept. When White Dove asked what Sarah could offer in exchange for food and help, Sarah's heart sank. She had nothing of value left. Her husband had taken their few valuable possessions when he left. The cabin was barely standing and contained nothing but broken furniture and empty containers. She had no skills that would be useful to the Modoc people, and she was too weak to do much physical work. Desperate, Sarah began talking about her baby. She explained that Emma was healthy and strong despite their current situation. The child had her father's blue eyes and her mother's thick hair. Sarah said she would rather see Emma raised by people who could feed and care for her than watch the baby slowly starve in the cold cabin. The words came out in a rush of desperation and tears. Sarah heard herself offering to give up her child in exchange for just enough food to survive until spring. A sack of beans, some dried meat. Anything that would keep her alive until her husband returned or until she could find another way to survive. The Modoc people around the fire became very quiet when they heard Sarah's offer. They exchanged glances and spoke in their own language, their voices low and serious. White Dove's expression didn't change, but her eyes seemed to see into Sarah's soul, understanding the depth of her desperation and the pain behind her words. After several minutes of discussion, White Dove turned back to Sarah. She explained that the Modoc people valued children highly and would never take a baby from its mother lightly. However, she also recognized that Sarah's situation was desperate, and they understood her willingness to make such a sacrifice to ensure her child's survival. White Dove told Sarah that they would need time to consider her request. The decision to accept a child into their tribe was not something that could be made quickly or by one person alone. The tribal council would need to discuss the matter, and there were many factors to consider. In the meantime, White Dove said, Sarah and the baby could stay in the camp for a few days. They would be fed and kept warm while the discussions took place. She pointed to a small teepee at the edge of the camp, where Sarah could rest with Emma. As Sarah was led to the teepee, she noticed that several Modoc people were watching her with expressions she couldn't read. Some seemed sympathetic to her situation, while others appeared more cautious or even suspicious. She realized that her presence in the camp was creating discussions and disagreements among the tribe members. The teepee was warm and comfortable, lined with thick furs and blankets. There was a small fire pit in the center and enough space for Sarah to lie down with the baby. As she settled in for her first warm night in weeks, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. She had found temporary shelter, but she had also set something in motion that she didn't fully understand. Outside the teepee, she could hear quiet conversations in the Modoc language. The tone suggested serious discussions were taking place about her situation. Sarah held Emma close and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake in offering to give up her child. But as she looked at the baby's thin face and felt how little warmth was in the tiny body, she knew she had been willing to do anything to save Emma's life. Sarah looked into White Dove's patient eyes and nodded slowly. Her voice was barely a whisper as she agreed to the Modoc terms, accepting that both she and Emma would become part of their tribe permanently. The words felt strange in her mouth, like she was speaking about someone else's life rather than her own. White Dove smiled for the first time since Sarah had arrived at the camp. She placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder and explained that the formal adoption ceremony would take place that evening, when all the tribe members could witness the commitment. Until then, Sarah should rest and prepare herself mentally for the changes that were coming. Throughout the day, various Modoc people visited Sarah's teepee to meet the woman and child who would soon become their family members. They brought small gifts, a warm pair of moccasins, a beautifully woven blanket for Emma, and herbs that would help Sarah's body recover from months of poor nutrition. Each visitor spoke a few words of welcome in broken English or through gestures that conveyed acceptance and kindness. As evening approached, Sarah felt increasingly nervous about what she had agreed to do. She had no clear picture of what her new life would look like, or how she would learn to fit into this community that was so different from everything she had known. The smell of cooking food drifted from the central fire area, reminding her that she was about to share her first meal as a Modoc family member. The adoption ceremony was simpler than Sarah had expected, but deeply meaningful. The entire tribe gathered around the central fire as White Dove spoke in the Modoc language about the arrival of new family members. An elderly man who appeared to be a spiritual leader blessed both Sarah and Emma with smoke from burning sage and spoke words that Sarah didn't understand but felt were important. White Dove then announced Sarah's new Modoc name, Rising Sun, explaining that it represented someone who brought light after a period of darkness. Emma was given the name Little Bird, symbolizing new life and the promise of flight. Sarah repeated her new name several times, trying to make it feel real and connected to her identity. The ceremony concluded with a feast where Sarah tasted food she had never encountered before. There were roasted roots that were sweet and filling, dried fish prepared with herbs that made it delicious, and a type of bread made from ground acorns that had a rich, nutty flavor. Everyone in the tribe made sure she and Emma had plenty to eat. And for the first time in months, Sarah felt truly full and satisfied. After the meal, White Dove began explaining some of the basic rules and expectations of Modoc life. Sarah learned that decisions in the tribe were made through discussion and consensus, not by individual choice. Everyone was expected to contribute to the community's welfare, according to their abilities, and everyone shared in the benefits when the community prospered. White Dove also explained that Sarah would need to learn the Modoc language as quickly as possible. While some tribe members spoke English, most daily communication happened in their native tongue. Sarah would be taught by different women who would help her understand not just words, but the cultural meanings behind them. The most challenging part of White Dove's explanation concerned Sarah's relationship with Emma. While they would both be part of the same tribe, Sarah would not have the same exclusive parental authority she had exercised before. Emma would be raised by the entire community, with multiple mothers and fathers who would all play roles in her upbringing and education. This concept frightened Sarah more than anything else about her new situation. She had given up her child to save Emma's life, but now she was learning that even as part of the same community, their relationship would be fundamentally different. Emma would not belong to her in the way she had always assumed children belonged to their birth parents. White Dove seemed to understand Sarah's concern. She explained that in Modoc culture, this community approach to child-rearing actually created stronger and more secure children. Emma would have many people who loved and cared for her, many teachers who would pass on different types of knowledge, and many role models who would help her develop into a strong and capable adult. That night, Sarah lay in her teepee holding Emma and wondering if she had made the right choice. The baby seemed content and healthy, already responding well to the warmth and regular feeding. But Sarah felt a deep sadness at the realization that her relationship with her daughter would never again be the intimate bond she had treasured during those difficult months in the cabin. As she listened to the quiet sounds of the camp, settling into sleep around her, Sarah tried to imagine what her life would be like in the months and years ahead. She would learn new skills, speak a new language, and follow customs that were still mysterious to her. Most importantly, she would have to find a way to be grateful for the survival and security the Modoc people had offered while grieving for the life and identity she had left behind. The transaction was complete, but Sarah was beginning to understand that what she had thought was a simple trade had actually been a complete transformation of everything she was and everything she had planned to become. Sarah looked into White Dove's patient eyes and nodded slowly. Her voice was barely a whisper as she agreed to the Modoc terms, accepting that both she and Emma would become part of their tribe permanently. The words felt strange in her mouth, like she was speaking about someone else's life rather than her own. White Dove smiled for the first time since Sarah had arrived at the camp. She placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder and explained that the formal adoption ceremony would take place that evening, when all the tribe members could witness the commitment. Until then, Sarah should rest and prepare herself mentally for the changes that were coming. Throughout the day, various Modoc people visited Sarah's teepee to meet the woman and child who would soon become their family members. They brought small gifts, a warm pair of moccasins, a beautifully woven blanket for Emma, and herbs that would help Sarah's body recover from months of poor nutrition. Each visitor spoke a few words of welcome in broken English or through gestures that conveyed acceptance and kindness. As evening approached, Sarah felt increasingly nervous about what she had agreed to do. She had no clear picture of what her new life would look like, or how she would learn to fit into this community that was so different from everything she had known. The smell of cooking food drifted from the central fire area, reminding her that she was about to share her first meal as a Modoc family member. The adoption ceremony was simpler than Sarah had expected, but deeply meaningful. The entire tribe gathered around the central fire as White Dove spoke in the Modoc language about the arrival of new family members. An elderly man who appeared to be a spiritual leader blessed both Sarah and Emma with smoke from burning sage and spoke words that Sarah didn't understand but felt were important. White Dove then announced Sarah's new Modoc name, Rising Sun, explaining that it represented someone who brought light after a period of darkness. Emma was given the name Little Bird, symbolizing new life and the promise of flight. Sarah repeated her new name several times, trying to make it feel real and connected to her identity. The ceremony concluded with a feast where Sarah tasted food she had never encountered before. There were roasted roots that were sweet and filling, dried fish prepared with herbs that made it delicious, and a type of bread made from ground acorns that had a rich, nutty flavor. Everyone in the tribe made sure she and Emma had plenty to eat. And for the first time in months, Sarah felt truly full and satisfied. After the meal, White Dove began explaining some of the basic rules and expectations of Modoc life. Sarah learned that decisions in the tribe were made through discussion and consensus, not by individual choice. Everyone was expected to contribute to the community's welfare, according to their abilities, and everyone shared in the benefits when the community prospered. White Dove also explained that Sarah would need to learn the Modoc language as quickly as possible. While some tribe members spoke English, most daily communication happened in their native tongue. Sarah would be taught by different women who would help her understand not just words, but the cultural meanings behind them. The most challenging part of White Dove's explanation concerned Sarah's relationship with Emma. While they would both be part of the same tribe, Sarah would not have the same exclusive parental authority she had exercised before. Emma would be raised by the entire community, with multiple mothers and fathers who would all play roles in her upbringing and education. This concept frightened Sarah more than anything else about her new situation. She had given up her child to save Emma's life, but now she was learning that even as part of the same community, their relationship would be fundamentally different. Emma would not belong to her in the way she had always assumed children belonged to their birth parents. White Dove seemed to understand Sarah's concern. She explained that in Modoc culture, this community approach to child rearing actually created stronger and more secure children. Emma would have many people who loved and cared for her, many teachers who would pass on different types of knowledge, and many role models who would help her develop into a strong and capable adult. That night, Sarah lay in her teepee holding Emma and wondering if she had made the right choice. The baby seemed content and healthy, already responding well to the warmth and regular feeding. But Sarah felt a deep sadness at the realization that her relationship with her daughter would never again be the intimate bond she had treasured during those difficult months in the cabin. As she listened to the quiet sounds of the camp, settling into sleep around her, Sarah tried to imagine what her life would be like in the months and years ahead. She would learn new skills, speak a new language, and follow customs that were still mysterious to her. Most importantly, she would have to find a way to be grateful for the survival and security the Modoc people had offered while grieving for the life and identity she had left behind. The transaction was complete, but Sarah was beginning to understand that what she had thought was a simple trade had actually been a complete transformation of everything she was and everything she had planned to become. The first weeks of Sarah's new life as Rising Sun were filled with constant learning and adjustment. Every morning began before sunrise with activities that were completely foreign to her previous experience as a settler's wife. She watched as Modoc women efficiently prepared food, tended to children, and maintained the camp with skills that seemed almost magical in their effectiveness. White Dove assigned Sarah to work alongside a younger woman named Singing Water, who had the patience to teach basic survival skills to someone who knew almost nothing about wilderness living. Singing Water showed Sarah how to identify edible plants even under snow, how to prepare animal hides for clothing and shelter, and how to preserve food so it would last through long winters. The language barrier created daily frustrations for Sarah. Simple concepts that she could express easily in English required pointing, gesturing, and repeated attempts in Modoc words that felt awkward on her tongue. She often found herself exhausted by the mental effort required to communicate basic needs and ideas, and she frequently misunderstood instructions that led to mistakes in her work. Emma, now called Little Bird, adapted much more quickly to tribal life than her mother did. The baby was passed between various women throughout the day, receiving attention and care from multiple mothers who each contributed different types of nurturing. Sarah watched with mixed emotions as her daughter smiled and responded to voices and faces that weren't her. On one particularly difficult day came when Sarah realized that Emma had begun responding more enthusiastically to White Dove's voice than to her own. The baby would calm more quickly when held by the elderly woman and seemed to recognize her scent and sounds in ways that had previously been reserved for Sarah alone. The practical benefits of shared childcare were obvious, but the emotional cost to Sarah was higher than she had anticipated. The physical demands of Modoc life were also challenging for Sarah, who had grown weak during her months of near starvation. Tasks that Modoc women completed easily left her breathless and exhausted. Her hands, soft from indoor domestic work, became cracked and sore from handling rough materials and working in cold weather. Her back ached from sleeping on the ground and bending over fires and workspaces, but there were also unexpected pleasures in her new life. The food was more varied and flavorful than anything she had eaten as a settler. The constant company of other women created a social environment that was far richer than the isolation she had experienced in her cabin. The children in the tribe were delightful, and their laughter and games brought joy to even the most difficult days. Sarah also began to appreciate the Modoc approach to problem solving. When challenges arose, the community members worked together to find solutions that benefited everyone. There was no single person struggling alone to figure out how to survive, as Sarah had been doing in her cabin. The collective knowledge and effort of the tribe made many problems seem manageable that would have been impossible for an individual to handle. As winter continued, Sarah noticed changes in herself that went beyond just learning new skills. She was becoming physically stronger and more confident in outdoor environments. Her hands were developing the calluses and competence needed for tribal work. More importantly, she was beginning to think differently about relationships, property, and community responsibility. The Modoc concept of shared ownership was particularly different from what Sarah had known in white society. Tools, food, and even children were considered community resources rather than private possessions. This meant that Sarah always had access to what she needed, but it also meant she had to contribute to meeting everyone else's needs. One evening around the central fire, Sarah listened to tribal stories told in the Modoc language. Although she understood only fragments of the words, she could follow the emotions and meanings through the storyteller's expressions and gestures. The stories seemed to be about the connection between people and the natural world, about the importance of balance and reciprocity in all relationships. After the storytelling, White Dove sat beside Sarah and spoke quietly about her progress in adapting to tribal life. She acknowledged that the transition was difficult, but praised Sarah's willingness to learn and her growing competence in essential skills. She also mentioned that some tribal members had expressed concern about Sarah's obvious sadness and frequent crying. White Dove explained that in Modoc culture, prolonged sadness was considered harmful, not just to the individual but to the entire community. She suggested that Sarah needed to find ways to accept her new life more completely, rather than continuing to grieve for what she had lost. The elderly woman's words were kind but firm, making it clear that Sarah's emotional adjustment was important for everyone's welfare. That night, Sarah lay in her teepee thinking about White Dove's advice. She realized that she had been holding on to hope that her husband might return and that she might somehow be able to resume her previous life. But as the months passed, it was becoming clear that her old life was truly over. The question now was whether she could find happiness and fulfillment in the life she had chosen, or whether she would remain forever caught between two worlds, fully belonging to neither. Spring arrived earlier than expected, bringing with it challenges that Sarah had not anticipated. As the snow began to melt and the first green shoots appeared, she learned that the Modoc people would soon be leaving their winter camp. The tribe followed seasonal patterns of movement that took advantage of different food sources and climate conditions throughout the year. The prospect of leaving the familiar camp where she had learned to survive filled Sarah with anxiety. She had just begun to feel comfortable with the routines and relationships of winter life, and now everything would change again. White Dove explained that spring meant traveling to traditional fishing grounds where the tribe would harvest salmon and other fish that were essential to their diet and economy. Preparing for the move required skills that Sarah had not yet learned. She watched as experienced women efficiently packed essential items while leaving behind things that seemed important to her, but were considered unnecessary by Modoc standards. The concept of traveling light while carrying everything needed for survival was foreign to someone who had always lived in a fixed location with accumulated possessions. Emma, now several months older and thriving in tribal care, would travel in a specially designed carrier that could be worn by any of the women during the journey. Sarah felt a pang of sadness when she realized that she would not be the primary person responsible for carrying and caring for her daughter during the trip. The baby had become so integrated into the community that her care was naturally shared among multiple caregivers. As the tribe began their spring migration, Sarah struggled with the physical demands of travel. Her feet, not yet hardened to long walks over rough terrain, developed painful blisters within the first day. Her back ached from the unfamiliar weight of the pack she carried, and she fell behind the group repeatedly, requiring other members to wait for her or help her keep up. More challenging than the physical difficulties was Sarah's realization that she was becoming a burden to the community. The Modoc people were naturally generous and patient, but she could see that her slowness and inexperience were affecting everyone's travel schedule. Children and elderly people in the tribe moved more efficiently than she did, highlighting her status as the least capable member of the group. During the journey, Sarah also encountered other Native American tribes for the first time. The Modoc people interacted with these groups through established protocols of diplomacy and trade that were completely unfamiliar to Sarah. She watched as tribal leaders engaged in formal discussions about territorial boundaries, resource sharing, and mutual assistance agreements. These interactions made Sarah more aware of the complex political situation surrounding Native American communities. She learned that the Modoc people were facing increasing pressure from white settlers and government officials who wanted them to move to designated reservation lands. The freedom to follow traditional migration patterns was becoming more difficult as white settlements expanded across the region. Sarah's presence in the tribe created additional complications in these political negotiations. Some other tribes viewed her with suspicion, wondering if she was a spy or a representative of white interests. Her obvious lack of Native American ancestry made her stand out in ways that could potentially cause problems for the Modoc people in their dealings with both white authorities and other tribes. White Dove took time during the journey to explain these political realities to Sarah. She learned that her adoption into the tribe was not just a personal matter but had broader implications for the community's relationships with the outside world. The Modoc people were taking risks by accepting a white woman, and Sarah had responsibilities to justify their trust and protection. When the tribe finally reached their spring fishing grounds, Sarah was amazed by the abundance of food that suddenly became available. The rivers were full of salmon returning to spawn, and the Modoc people demonstrated fishing techniques that had been refined over generations. Within days, they had caught enough fish to feed the entire community for months, with surplus that could be dried and preserved for future needs. Sarah was assigned to work with the women who processed the caught fish, learning how to clean, fillet, and prepare them for drying. The work was messy and tiring, but she found satisfaction in contributing meaningfully to the community's food supply. Her hands became skilled at tasks that had seemed impossible just weeks before, and she began to feel more confident about her ability to be useful to the tribe. However, The fishing season also brought disturbing news from the outside world. Other travelers and traders who passed through the area reported that government officials were becoming more aggressive about forcing Native American tribes onto reservations. There were stories of military actions against tribes that refused to relocate, and rumors that the Modoc people would soon face ultimatums about their own future. This news created tension and debate within the tribe. Some members argued for cooperation with government demands, believing that resistance would only bring violence and suffering. Others insisted that they should maintain their traditional way of life regardless of outside pressure. Sarah found herself in the difficult position of being connected to both sides of this conflict through her white ancestry and her adopted tribal membership. As spring turned toward summer, Sarah realized that the challenges she had faced in adapting to Modoc life were small compared to the larger forces that were threatening to destroy the community that had saved her life. The tribe that had claimed all she had to offer was now facing the possibility of losing everything they had built over generations of living in harmony with their environment. The confrontation that had been building for months finally came in late summer when a group of government officials and soldiers arrived at the Modoc fishing grounds with orders for the tribe to relocate to a reservation hundreds of miles away. The officials were polite but firm, explaining that all Native American tribes in the region were required to move to designated lands where they would be provided with housing, food, and education in American ways of life. Sarah watched from the edge of the crowd as White Dove and other tribal leaders listened to the government representatives. The translation of the official demands created murmurs of anger and distress throughout the community. The Modoc people were being told to abandon their ancestral lands and traditional way of life in exchange for government supervision and support that none of them wanted. During the tense negotiations that followed, Sarah found herself in an unexpected position. Some government officials recognized her as a white woman and assumed she was being held against her will by the tribe. They offered to rescue her and return her to white society, not understanding that she had chosen to become part of the Modoc community. Sarah's response to these offers created surprise and confusion among the officials. She explained that she was not a captive but a willing member of the tribe who had found safety and purpose in Modoc society. Her testimony about the generosity and wisdom of the people who had saved her life contradicted the stereotypes and assumptions that guided government policy toward Native Americans. The officials were particularly interested in Sarah's story because it provided evidence that could be used to justify their policies. They argued that if a white woman could successfully adapt to Native American life, then Native Americans should be able to adapt to white society. They proposed using Sarah as an example of successful cultural integration, completely missing the irony of their argument. White Dove and the tribal council faced an impossible choice. They could agree to relocate to the reservation, abandoning their traditional territories and accepting government control over their daily lives. Or they could resist the orders and face military action that would likely result in deaths and the eventual forced removal of survivors to the reservation anyway. The debate within the tribe continued for several days, with different families and individuals expressing varying opinions about the best course of action. Some argued that cooperation offered the best chance for survival, even if it meant sacrificing their traditional way of life. Others maintained that life on the reservation would not really be life at all, and that resistance was necessary to preserve their dignity and cultural identity. Sarah found herself torn between her loyalty to her adopted community and her understanding of the superior military power that backed the government demands. She had lived in both worlds and could see that the Modoc people's traditional way of life was doomed, regardless of their choice. The expanding white settlement and government policies would eventually eliminate all opportunities for independent Native American communities. During this crisis, Sarah's relationship with Emma became even more complicated. The one-year-old child was now completely integrated into Modoc society, speaking her first words in the Modoc language and responding to tribal customs as her natural environment. If the tribe was forced onto the reservation, Emma would face the same cultural destruction as other tribal members. If Sarah chose to return to white society, she would be separating her daughter from the only family and culture the child had ever known. The final decision came when word arrived that military reinforcements were being sent to enforce the relocation order. White Dove called a final tribal council meeting where the community had to choose between immediate surrender or armed resistance that would likely end in tragedy. In a decision that surprised many people, including Sarah, the tribal council chose a third option. They decided to scatter into small groups that would disperse across the region, making it difficult for authorities to locate and round them up. Some families would eventually make their way to the reservation when survival became impossible. Others would try to blend into white society or join other tribes in more remote areas. White Dove approached Sarah with a final choice that would determine the rest of her life. She could stay with the small group of Modoc people who planned to continue living in the traditional way, in hidden locations throughout the mountains. This would mean a life of constant danger and uncertainty, but it would preserve the cultural connections she had built over the past year. Alternatively, Sarah could use her white ancestry to return to settler society, taking Emma with her and trying to build a new life using the survival skills she had learned from the Modoc people. This option offered more safety and stability, but it would mean abandoning the community that had saved both their lives when they were desperate and starving. The choice was made even more difficult by Emma's obvious comfort and happiness in Modoc society. The child had thrived under community care and had learned to walk and speak in an environment where she was surrounded by loving attention from many adults. Taking her away from this nurturing community felt like a betrayal of everything the Modoc people had done for them. Sarah spent her last night in the camp, holding Emma and thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had been a desperate mother willing to give up her child for a sack of beans. The Modoc people had quietly waited while she made that desperate offer, then claimed not just her child but her entire life, transforming both mother and daughter in ways she could never have imagined. Now she understood what White Dove had meant when she said that everything had a price and nothing was given freely. The Modoc people had saved Sarah and Emma's lives, but in accepting that salvation, Sarah had given up her old identity, her cultural connections, and her individual autonomy. She had become part of something larger than herself, with responsibilities and loyalties that extended far beyond her personal desires. As dawn broke over the camp for the last time, Sarah made her final decision. She would stay with the small group of Modoc people who chose to remain hidden in the mountains, accepting the dangers and uncertainties of that life, rather than abandoning the community that had made her survival possible. Emma would grow up as Little Bird, learning the ancient skills and wisdom that had sustained her adoptive people for generations. The government officials returned to find an empty camp and no trace of where the Modoc people had gone. Sarah Mitchell, the desperate settler woman who had once pleaded to sell her child for beans, had disappeared entirely. In her place was Rising Sun, a woman who had learned that true survival meant belonging to something greater than individual need, and that the price of salvation was the complete transformation of everything she had thought she was. Years later, travelers in the remote mountain areas would sometimes report glimpses of small groups of Native Americans living in the traditional way, including a woman with light hair who moved through the wilderness with the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in that harsh but beautiful environment. But these were just rumors and stories, and no official records ever confirmed the existence of Modoc people who had successfully avoided the reservation system. The transaction that had begun with a desperate mother's offer to trade her child for food had evolved into something much more complex and profound. The Modoc people had indeed claimed all that Sarah had to offer, but in doing so they had given her and her daughter a form of wealth that could not be measured in material possessions, the knowledge of how to live in harmony with the natural world, and the security of belonging to a community that valued every member's contribution to their collective survival.